So I know last time we were going fairly quickly at the end through the end popes of the Avignon period, and we left off right at the very end, I think, with Gregory the 11th. And Gregory the 11th, just as one of his predecessors had, wanted to go back to Rome, and so he was Clement the Sixth's nephew. Again, a sort of literal example of nepotism. And Gregory the 11th decides to go back to Rome, but dies about a year after he had returned to Rome, while he was in the process of going back to Avignon. So Rome is still not a very good place for the popes to be. They don't like it. They're not very safe there. And so Gregory the 11th, in 1377, goes to Rome, but the following year realizes, you know what, I think I'm better off back in Avignon. So he's underway with the process of moving back to Avignon when he dies. And this is going to really spark a series of events that lead to a great problem within the church. So after Gregory the 11th's death, the cardinals wind up, most of them had kind of moved with him to Rome. Some were in Avignon, but a good portion were in Rome. And so they gathered together in Rome for a conclave. There were 16 cardinals in Avignon for the conclave, and 16 in Rome, and then 6 back in Avignon. And so the majority of the cardinals were, in fact, at the conclave in Rome. There's a little bit of murkiness around exactly what happened, but it certainly seems as if the Roman people had gotten pretty sick of the Pope, their bishop, the Bishop of Rome, not being anywhere near Rome. And so they were afraid that the next Pope was going to wind up going back to Avignon. And so there's a sense in which the people felt like this was an opportunity to try to make clear that the Pope needed to stay. And during the conclave, there were crowds that gathered outside and were demanding a Roman Pope, demanding someone from Rome. The conclave had a couple different factions, but in the end, with all this raucous crowd activity outside, they wound up making a selection fairly quickly, and they chose an Italian archbishop who had been an administrator at Avignon and was, again, from Italy. So he wasn't actually Roman the way the crowds were asking for a Roman, but he was Italian, from another region. So that was close enough. And this archbishop takes the name of Urban VI. And Urban VI, again, in 1378, becomes Pope. So far, so good. But the problem is Urban VI winds up undertaking a series of, what we would call erratic behaviors. He starts acting kind of wildly, very vindictive. A number of his opponents within the church, he has thrown in jail with little cause. He has some violent outbursts. There's a way in which, looking back, some people sort of speculated maybe he was, mentally ill, some kind of paranoia was afflicting him. We can't say that for certain, obviously, but it's definitely, his behavior definitely suggested, there might be something to that claim. He was highly, highly erratic. And the cardinals who had elected him see this behavior, and they get very worried. About 2 months in to his papacy, most of the cardinals decide to leave Rome and kind of get away, because they were afraid that if they rubbed the Pope the wrong way or made themselves an enemy of his, that they would be punished, maybe thrown in jail, maybe worse. So they leave Rome and go to Agnani, that's that famous place the same city where that humiliation at Anagni occurred. And in August of 1378, the cardinals who left Rome publicly repudiate the election of Urban VI. And they said basically, we are renouncing and distancing ourselves from this. It was not a free election. It had taken place under duress, and therefore it's not valid. It wasn't a free election. The crowds and the pressure from the people invalidates this election. And so they said this isn't a true election. It's not a real way that the Pope is supposed to be chosen. And the cardinals do something after declaring the election invalid. They meet and select a different Pope who takes the name Clement VII. Clement VII winds up going back to Avignon and hangs out, with now the majority of cardinals who had left Rome and returned to Avignon. So we have Urban VI first elected, and then Clement VII also being elected. Now, we've seen in the class before some examples where, you have the Pope and the anti-Pope. But what was different about this one was that it was the same group of cardinals who had elected both popes. And so that's what's going to make this particularly challenging. Never before had the same group of cardinals elected one pope, sworn loyalty to him, then declared it invalid and elected another one, who they then supported as the legitimate pope. So this is a problem, and this is the beginning of the Great Schism. I think one of the interesting things to recognize about the schism that's opening up here is that it was genuinely confusing who the real pope was supposed to be. You see this incredible division across, the West, across Europe, where, kings start to consider which pope to back based on political alliances, which maybe isn't surprising. But even within religious orders, there's division where some orders, let's say, who live in France, thought that Clement VII was the real pope, whereas same order, but they have a monastery in Italy or in southern Italy, let's say, they might think it was Urban. And so it just really wasn't clear. You have saints, frankly, on both sides. Catherine of Siena backed Urban, but Vincent Ferrer backed the Avignon line. So it wasn't clear cut. It really wasn't. There's a story that some priests took to when they were praying the Eucharistic prayer, and they got to the intention for the Holy Father, they would say, we want to pray for our Pope, whoever he is, or whichever one he may be. So it was quite a situation that had developed as a result of this multiple popes being elected by the same group of cardinals. So what's the solution? Well, it didn't appear right away. There were different ideas thrown out, lots of possibilities talked about, and a number of these solutions either were untenable or kind of unlikely to succeed. So some people were saying, we should just kind of battle it out. The via facti, that whoever wins this will, that will demonstrate God's will. But the problem is then both popes would have to raise armies, and that's kind of cumbersome, let's say, and perhaps not the most Christian way of resolving a problem. Another way was what was called the via sessionis, and these terms are on your outline. And that was the way of mutual cession. And you might sort of guess that from the name that both popes would resign their powers and clear the way for a new election. In other words, they would both kind of agree that they're going to step down, then the cardinals would all get back together and go from there and select a new pope. But the problem was, maybe you anticipate this already, you kind of have okay, that sounds good, but you go first. That was the deal. So neither side wanted to really be the first one to say, okay, I'll resign, or here's my letter of resignation, with the fear that, what if the other pope just says, oh, I changed my mind, and thanks for resigning, so now I'm the real pope. So that wasn't going anywhere. There was also the via compromessi, the way of compromise, which was the idea that there would kind of be like an arbitration panel. You'd get some impartial board that would decide, like an independent sort of group of people, respected people, to determine who the right pope is. But it's just like when certain kinds of committees are formed today in politics. Both sides want to stack the committee with who they like and who they believe and are confident will favor them. So that doesn't go anywhere. So that leaves the fourth possibility, the via concilii, or the way of the council, which is to convene a general council in order to resolve the schism. And that's exactly what we'll see, and that's what will eventually resolve this, but not without some bumps and bruises along the way. So before we turn to the way of the council, which is also a movement known as conciliarism, just to point out what was happening, because I talked about the cardinals leaving Rome back after they sort of deserted Urban VI. Well, that seems like a problem for Urban, right? That he lost most of his support. Except, guess who creates cardinals? The Pope does, as we know. And so, just kind of backtracking for a second, you have the cardinals who kind of elected Urban and then changed their mind and elected Clement, and now that's the majority of the cardinals who existed, prior to this whole mess breaking out. But in the meantime, as these cardinals desert and then repudiate the election of Urban VI, Urban VI just goes ahead and creates a whole new batch of cardinals. And at the time, he was, the only pope. This is before the cardinals who elected him had elected Clement. And so now you have a new set of cardinals freshly made under Urban VI, and the existing cardinals mostly had rejected Urban VI and elected Clement. So it was a very messy situation, very confusing about how to resolve it. And ultimately, it's going to take the convening of a general council, and in fact multiple councils, to work this out. So that's the outbreak of the Great Schism, or the Great Schism, and next we'll turn, as I say, to conciliarism, or the conciliar movement.